Welcome to the Dare to Know podcast. I'm your host, Fabian Korver. Today we are joined by two guests, Carol Rovane and Akeel Bilgrami. Both are professor of philosophy at Columbia University. Professor Rovane's current research focuses on several interrelated topics: the first person, personal identity, relativism, the foundations of value, group versus individual responsibility, and some new problems for liberal theory. And she's the author of the books The Bounds of Agency, an essay in Revisionary Metaphysics, and The Metaphysics and Ethics of Relativism. Professor Bilgrami has two relatively independent sets of intellectual interests: in the philosophy of mind and language, and in political philosophy and moral psychology, especially as they surface in politics, political economy, history, and culture. He's the author of several books, including Belief and Meaning, Self-Knowledge and Resentment, and Secularism, Identity, and Enchantment. I hope you enjoyed this episode. The Dare to Know podcast is now also available on iTunes and Spotify. Please check out the links in the description below. Professor Rovane and Professor Bilgrami, welcome to the Dare to Know podcast.
Thank you.
Very nice to be here, Phil.
Yes, great to have you both here. So before starting, could maybe both of you tell a little bit about your background? How did you get into philosophy? And also maybe where did your engagement with Noam Chomsky come from?
So B becomes before A, Akeel, so you go first.
Well, I came across Chomsky not in philosophy or linguistics, but as a teenager in college in Bombay. I was involved in left-wing politics, and Chomsky was sort of a hero of all of ours. And then I went to England and I studied in Oxford, and he had just come to Oxford a few years earlier, and had given the Locke lectures, and people were still talking quite a lot about it, and comparing it to philosophers, comparing his work to philosophers like Davidson, and so that's when I first began to read him as a linguist and philosopher. And then when I came to Chicago, I took courses with Jim Macaulay, who had studied with him, and so on. So as a graduate student, I got into linguistics and philosophy much more, and got to know his work a little better.
That's great. And Professor Rovane?
So I also started out in philosophy and philosophy of language. And Chomsky was part of the syllabus, part of the diet of the young philosopher interested in language. So I knew his work from early on in my studies. And then, like many, my interests expanded over the years into philosophy of mind, philosophy of action, metaphysics, and ethics. And he was sort of left to the side for many years. But an abiding interest of mine really is in what is a first person point of view. And there are many ways to conceive it, and they all involve some form of subjectivity. And those interests eventually led me back to looking at Chomsky on the nature of subjectivity, the relation of mind to other things. I thought he had some very useful correctives to standard philosophical ways of setting up some problems in philosophy of mind. And one thing led to another. And I, like you, I'm very interested in Kant and on limits in understanding. And so that was another side of Chomsky combined with McGinn that interested me intensely in the last couple of decades.
No, that's really interesting, and so we will unpack a lot of these topics during this conversation. So, maybe to start off, we're going to talk in particular about Chomsky's book, what kind of creatures are we, and then also a related article that both of you co-wrote in the Cambridge Companion to Chomsky, titled "Mind, Language, and the Limits of Inquiry." So maybe to start off, in what kind of creatures are we? It raises a fundamental and ancient question. And Chomsky starts by saying, of course, that he's not deluded, that he can provide, a full or satisfactory answer to this fundamental question. However, he does think there's some interesting insights that can be discovered, especially related to our cognitive natures or us as biological beings. So he addresses three specific questions in this book. So first of all, what is language? Second, what are the limits of human understanding? And then the third question, what is the common good? So before diving into the details of this book, Professor Bilgrami, maybe you can just help us understand what are those relationships between those questions that Chomsky is raising.
Well, the relationship is, of course, there in the title. They're all questions that relate to trying to elaborate what kind of creatures we are. And the first chapter answers that question by saying what is unique about us, the possession of language. The second chapter talks about our cognitive abilities and their limitations. And I suppose all creatures, not just us, have limitations of cognitive abilities, but Chomsky is particularly keen to say that though we are possessed of unique cognitive abilities and of language, we also have our limitations. And in fact, the possession of these abilities precisely are responsible for the limitations as well. And so that's the theme of the second chapter, our cognitive limitations. And the third chapter is interesting because it actually lifts a restriction that is very important to how he conceives of our language faculty. He thinks that the concept of language is most fruitfully studied when we think of it in terms that are individualistic, that are internal to individuals. And he lifts that restriction in the third chapter because he acknowledges that we are, after all, social creatures as well. And then he raises all these questions of ethics and politics about what happens when individuals, constituted as we are, with creative capacities that we have, nevertheless have to relate to each other in social contexts. And that raises a whole set of questions of the common good.
Mm-hmm. No, I do think it's interesting, and I think this book really is covering a lot of ground, because it is noticeable sometimes to me that Chomsky is also sometimes hesitant when it's about language and politics. Then people say, okay, how much does your linguistic views inform your political views? And then he usually says, well, like there was one lecture, I think it was language and politics, and then he said, well, the end doesn't do any work because we just have language and separately politics. But here that he seems to accept a little bit more of potential relationships between the two, or at least that it can guide us into specific directions for these questions. So I think that's very interesting.
That's right. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So kind of maybe diving into the first chapter, what is language? Chomsky discusses his insights, into the nature of language, as well as evaluating a lot of historical figures that are important for Chomsky, ranging from, Aristotle, Descartes, von Humboldt, and Darwin. And it is von Humboldt that clearly identifies a strong link between language and thought. So, Professor Bilgrami, maybe how does Chomsky, conceive of this relationship between language and thought?
Well, it's very important for Chomsky to see language, the very concept of language. He thinks it's very important to get clear about what language is, if one is to give a scientific account of it. Remember, he's a scientist of language. He really wants to give a scientific explanation and what he calls theoretical understanding of certain phenomena. So he wants to treat them as natural phenomena and give an account of them as we give account of any other natural phenomena. So for him, it's essentially a biological phenomenon, but until we know much more about the biological underpinnings of language, we have to do it at a more abstract level, which is the level of representation and computation and cognition and so on. So it's, for him, the biological phenomenon, the natural phenomenon, it has to be studied at a level of computation and of cognition, and so he thinks of it essentially as a study of of our capacity for thinking, and language is really an instrument of our capacity for thinking. And this just comes from the focus on biology, of the natural phenomenon. So one of the things that's very important to understand is that this idea of language is got what he calls two interfaces, right? One is the interface which, what he calls the basic property of language is that it's a computational procedure which is generative, and that he's been saying for a very, very long time. And the idea is that linguistic expressions are structured expressions because they have this hierarchical quality that makes for generativity, but they have two interfaces, and one is with the sensory motor interface, which is where what is thought or language gets articulated and communicated, and that makes for eventually for the social aspects of communicative aspects of language. But then there's the other interface, which he calls the conceptual intentional interface for mental processes. And that's the one where is much more primary for Chomsky. So you don't really understand what his goals are unless you understand that language's interface with the conceptual intentional is primary, and the other is secondary. The externalization, the sensory motor interface is secondary. That's very crucial to understanding, and that's why I think many anthropologists and so on of language who've criticized him just don't. It's like two ships passing each other by. They just don't get what his subject is. So it isn't an appropriate criticism. It just isn't targeting the right thing that he's intending to make the object of study. Okay, so now once you see that the sensory motor interface is secondary, then I think a whole lot of things fall into place, details fall into place. So he's very much committed to the idea that what we really can only study scientifically are what he calls I languages, which are languages which are, I is just a sort of mnemonic for individual, internal, and intentional. And that's what can be scientifically studied. and I think for him, it's very important because many of the things that he thinks are structural have the features they do only because the external and the communicative aspect is ancillary and not basic. And that's the reason why when, for instance, he says, I think he says in those lectures that Aristotle said that languages sound with meaning. He wants to reverse that. And it's very interesting, a whole lot of philosophers raise questions about language by saying, isn't it odd that some sounds are different? So the sound that you hear when you hear a rock fall from the, what's the difference between the sound coming out of my lips, the sound on my lips and that? John Searle and others put the question of language that way. And I think Chomsky thinks that distorts the real nature of language in the same way that Aristotle's order of things distorts it. And the right thing to think of is that thought is basic, mental processes are basic, and language is, sound is a part of the externalization, depending on the vocalizations and the capacities for vocalizations that creatures have. So, so one of the things to keep in mind is that this is actually rather important for him if you are even to understand the nature of the origins of language. Because you'll get the evolutionary account wrong unless you understand what the phenotype is correctly, and so that's why he's stressing this meaning over sound or thought over articulation, and all the features of structure, hierarchy, and so on. The differences he claims are there between structural distance and linear distance and so on, come because of the stress on the conceptual intentional interface over the sensory motor interface.
And Chomsky specifically postulates the computational operation merge. So maybe just kind of understanding the importance of this specific mechanism that he postulates. So what does he mean by merge?
Right. So, merge is the sort of Chomsky's minimalization of things that he had said earlier. Merge is really, it's speaking to the point you made about Humboldt, about the generativity of, an infinite number of things from a finite base. Merge is basically, it's a cognitive function that in its simplest form makes it possible for you to take two things and construct a thing that is the set of two things. Right? So to take two individual things and construct something that is the set of two things. So it takes objects already constructed and constructs from them a new object. Right? And the important thing is that it is unbounded. So, and that's the crucial thing, so you can't, people have compared it to merging by computers and so on, but it's not that, because it's unbounded. It's more abstract. It's not limited by that. So it isn't a matter of some kind of proto-language or anything like that. It's just a brand new thing that happens, and it's a very important part to understand its unbounded nature is very important in understanding why he says what he says about evolution of language, right? Because it's not some primitive proto-language which then slowly evolves, but rather he thinks of it much more likely to be a mutation in an individual, which then in a breeding cluster spreads, and so it's very important to get that aspect of it, to get the evolutionary story right for him. Of course, this is very controversial, but essentially the complexities of language is basically symbol processing of computations on posited representations, which are just a complex version of this very simple starting point in merge.
Oh, very fascinating. And kind of moving to another topic, a distinction that Chomsky has made between mysteries and problems. And in particular, he makes sort of this distinction in the context of understanding our cognitive capacities. And I even noticed this quote by Chomsky. So he even makes a remark, and I quote, "Those who accept modern biology should therefore be Mysterians." So Professor Rovane, how should we understand this distinction, and how does it relate to us as biological creatures?
So on the assumption that minds are things that evolved and they belong to organisms and are in some sense biological phenomena, you should think of the various mental capacities or abilities that human beings have on the model of a biological ability. Now, Chomsky's notion of this, of an ability is really broad. I mean, he's also interested in the abilities of genes, the abilities of things we wouldn't think of as mental. But he has this very general claim that strikes me as undeniable, which is that any ability, if it has a scope, there's something outside the scope that the ability isn't for. So anytime you're enabled to do one thing, that means there's something else you're not enabled to do, simply by virtue of having the ability to do the one thing. And the simplest example I like to give is motor abilities, like slithering like a snake versus walking. And if you have the ability to slither like a snake, you will not have the ability to walk. Right?
Yep.
Another example might be if you can, a creature needs air in order to be alive, and animals need to respirate. And if you can respirate and get oxygen from the air, you probably have a respiratory ability that makes it impossible for you to live underwater, even though there is oxygen in water. And fish can get oxygen from water, but of course they can't get it from the air. So any mental ability that cognitive scientists posit, any mental ability that they can study, is going to have the same feature. If it suits us to solve certain problems, that's, I think, the most fundamental conception that Chomsky has of a mental ability, that it can solve a problem in some sense. Then we will be unsuited to solve other problems. He thinks we shouldn't think of ourselves as being at the top of a hierarchy, where our abilities make us special because we have language or a universal instrument of some kind. But we can solve certain problems. Other species can solve other problems. Even rats can solve problems we can't very well solve. And there are lots that we can solve that they can't solve. And then there's this fact that we're reflective and can think about and identify the problems that we're solving. And sometimes these problems are things we don't have obvious answers to, but can engage in some form of inquiry in order to get somewhere with them. But we have to allow for the possibility, as good naturalists who view the mind as a biological phenomenon, that there might be ultimate limits, and that there are certain kinds of questions that we can't frame at all. But there might also be questions we can frame but can't answer, ever. Just as we'll never become things that can slither like snakes. And those will be the mysteries.
And just to kind of dive a little bit deeper into that point, so I think that's maybe where a little bit of the controversy lies, where people say, oh, we can actually coherently formulate these questions, and in the case of rats, not being able to do certain things, they cannot even raise the question. So people think, okay, in that specific way that we can pose the question, it already makes us different than other biological beings. And Daniel Dennett, another prominent philosopher, actually said about this argument of Chomsky that it's sort of a biological pseudo argument, while Chomsky says it's a truism. So a little bit of a gap, I suppose. So do you think these complaints by, for example, Daniel Dennett have any force, or how do you respond to that?
So I think that Chomsky has given us an interesting project to pursue, and he presents it as that. Consider the question: are any of the problems that we have not yet solved problems that remain unsolved because of our intrinsically limited cognitive abilities? That's just an open question. And so to be a Mysterian doesn't necessarily mean that you've identified which things are mysteries for us. That would require having a complete cognitive scientific account of what our abilities are.
Yep.
Right? Okay, so I think it's fair enough for him to say we can inquire into this. It's a meaningful form of inquiry. And I think that Dennett's attitude that if we can formulate the question, we can definitely answer it, can be understood in two different ways. One is it could be a kind of normative view that pragmatists hold, And that Dewey actually, because these are the Dewey lectures we're discussing by Chomsky, right? And Dewey said, never throw roadblocks in the path of inquiry, right? Never say we'll never get an answer to this question, just keep inquiring, right? And that could be a kind of normatively, kind of like a commitment, I'm never going to give up. And that is compatible with Chomsky being right that there are some questions we never will answer. Okay, but why should we be able to answer a question? I mean, ask a question that we can't answer. I think that's where Dennett's on somewhat stronger ground. The rats can't even see the things they can't understand. And here, I guess I would add something to what Chomsky says, and that is, but it's very much drawn from his picture of the mind. If you think of cognitive abilities in connection with the modularity of mind, in connection with this idea that there are many different kinds of abilities, and in different creatures, you might get some without others. You might get vision in some, but not in all. You might get, but not just sensory capacities, but different kinds of computational abilities. There's no guarantee that these abilities all harmonize extremely well. And I think the fact that we have multiple cognitive abilities puts us in a position to ask questions about connections between things we learn by using different cognitive abilities. And there's no a priori reason why, every kind of problem that comes up in the life of a creature with many abilities will be such that they can get a very unified kind of response to that problem, especially if it doesn't bear on your capacity to survive and reproduce in biological terms, right? There's no reason why a creature should be able to achieve satisfaction on all fronts just because they're evolved. And that includes, I would say, intellectual satisfaction.
And one thing that just popped up in my mind, and I'm not sure if you thought about this, is maybe also, in the discussion about AI, some people have been kind of, hopeful that they think this might actually extend certain of our capacities. So, but there are still, Chomsky seems to be hesitant. Wait a minute, we do have maybe, certain sort of cognitive constraints, while others are still optimistic. They might say, no, we do have those constraints, but we can just overcome them, or sort of a technological basis. Do you think that's this discussion is relevant for understanding the problem versus mystery distinction?
I think that the AI folks, might be operating like pragmatists, like let's just always see if we can develop a new method, a new strategy, a new kind of formal system that will be able to do things that our brains aren't so good at. And that's fine. But I think that doing it in the spirit of there is nothing that will defy human intelligence is anti-naturalist. I think Chomsky's right about that if you just think that this is a natural phenomenon and that it's an abilities-based phenomenon, the idea of an infinite ability, the idea of an unlimited ability, and the idea of an all-purpose ability, that can just do anything, all of those strike me as implausible ideas from a naturalistic perspective. And I think he's on strong ground. Yeah.
No, certainly. And also, you also discuss, I think, in this context of mysteries versus problems, the philosopher McGinn, and he describes his view as transcendental naturalism, getting some of his inspiration from Kant's critical philosophy. And this made me think about a quote by Kant. So let me just read it. So Kant famously says, and I quote, "Human reason has the peculiar fate that in one species of its cognition it is burdened by a question that, as prescribed by the very nature of reason itself, it is not able to ignore, but that, as transcending all its powers, it is not able to answer." So this paragraph kind of reminded me, at least, of this, discussion between, the distinction between mysteries and problems. So, first of all, Professor Rovane, could you maybe elaborate on some of McGinn's work on mysteries versus problems, and then we can maybe compare it a little bit with sort of Kant's ideas and views?
Okay, so McGinn has a very simple hypothesis, really. I mean, it doesn't have a lot of parts. He arrives at the hypothesis by looking at a very simple picture of what science is like, and a sort of potted history of philosophy, I guess. Okay. So the simple picture of science is that human minds got really good at science when they used their abilities to think about atoms, which are combined, like chemistry as well as syntax here, and and to find laws that govern the behavior of things that can be conceived in these terms of combinations of atoms. So these two abilities, looking for atomistic structure and combinations of them, and looking for law-like mappings among various phenomena that we meet. And he thinks that's what scientists do. And he thinks that lots of the most interesting problems scientists have solved can be sort of understood in this as sort of living up to this kind of hankering we have to model things in these ways. And he calls this CALM, C-A-L-M, for standing for combinatorial atomism and law-like mappings. And he thinks that there are lots and lots of problems that we face, sort of like rats in mazes, who can, that we can solve using this scientific method. And he thinks that the history of philosophy is full of problems that did not yield to this kind of scientific approach, and that we can kind of almost foresee that it will never yield to them, and that it's a good hypothesis that these are insoluble problems for the human mind. And so, so all of this adds up to a neo-Kantian picture on which it turns out calm, this strategy we use in science, might just be a cognitive structure that runs through most of our problem solving, and that mysteries arise for us when we ask questions that can't be answered using that strategy.
That's very interesting. And maybe just one follow-up question that comes to mind, like when he puts like those specific conditions, like for science in place, like to me, it reminds me kind of Chomsky postulating maybe the science forming faculty, but he's specifically putting sort of a strategy on top of that, saying, oh, this is, what that amounts to, while Chomsky might be much more open. No, we have no clue yet what the science forming faculty amounts to, right? That might be the difference to kind of compare them, I guess.
Chomsky, McGinn is giving a bold hypothesis, right? About what unifies science and much human cognitive activity. And Chomsky's on the ground looking at many, many, many different human abilities and seeing what their basis is and what they deliver and how they cooperate or not, as the case may be. And he's much more aware of what's going on in actual empirical inquiry in cognitive science. But he was very struck by McGinn's work because McGinn did understand that basic point about the essentially limited quality of any natural or biologically given ability. And he also, I think, quite fairly makes an analogy to Kant, because Kant basically said, if anything is knowable by us, it has to be accessible to our particular subjective ways of knowing things, right? And that is a given kind of cognitive constitution that Kant describes. And McGinn is just saying, well, as naturalists, we should be Kantians. We should think, yes, we have a cognitive constitution, and it allows some things to come, come before us as knowers, but not everything.
Mm-hmm. So the mind-body problem has also been extensively discussed in, the contemporary philosophy. So, Chomsky thinks there's a problem in that because he thinks that we cannot really formulate the mind-body problem. And you mentioned in your article that his reasons are both historical and scientific. So, Professor Rovane, could you maybe explain why Chomsky thinks that we cannot even coherently formulate the mind-body problem? And then what are those historical and scientific reasons for denying this problem?
All right, so he thinks that there used to be a mind-body problem that could be raised. It could be raised against the backdrop of a particular set of kind of scientific and metaphysical commitments, Cartesian commitments. Descartes thought that the mind was an immaterial thinking thing, and he thought that in the physical world, all causation must require actual bumping up in space. Contact mechanics was the phrase that Chomsky used. So he had a contact mechanical conception of causation. But if the mind is an immaterial thing, it can't bump up against anything in space. And so Descartes faced a genuine problem about how the mind can interact with the body. And according to Chomsky, once Newton came along and offered his theory of gravitational attraction, um, he posited action at a distance. He posited a form of causation that didn't require actual contact in space. And so in whatever way mental phenomena may occur, in whatever dimension, it just doesn't matter. The question whether they can causally interact with the rest of what physics studies was no longer a problem. And Chomsky is a very, very nice way of putting the issue, which is that if you have a problem about the relation of mind to body, you need both terms to be clear, mind and body, and you need each term to present you with a conception of something, and then you can't fit the conceptions together. And that is what happened with Descartes. He had a well-defined conception of body, and mind as an immaterial substance, a well-defined conception of body as something that can causally interact through this contact mechanical, in this contact mechanical way. And after Newton, physics was no longer bound by the contact mechanical conception. And the history of physics has shown, in fact, that the notion of body is an extremely unstable notion. It keeps getting revised with each new kind of bit of development in physical theory. And so the idea that we'll never be able to sort of situate the mind in the natural order no longer looks like the same kind of problem that it did look like before. And he thinks, and so he then would just say, you know, why are philosophers going on and on about this so-called mind-body problem when the notion of body is so capacious and so responsive to the problems that get set for scientists, that we should just be optimists here.
Mm-hmm. And sorry. And how does this relate kind of to the discussion we had before, but related to a problem versus mystery, specifically related to the mind-body problem?
So I think someone like McGinn might suppose, or someone who read McGinn, might suppose that the mind-body problem will never be solved because we cannot really make sense of mental phenomena on the model of physical phenomena as he wants to do it with this strategy of using combinatorial atomism and law-like mappings. And of course, there are many naturalistic philosophers who think perhaps consciousness will be eliminated from science, perhaps consciousness will be reduced. But McGinn isn't such a person. He thinks consciousness is something everyone is kind of directly acquainted with. We know it from our own case, and how it could possibly relate to the rest of the world is, as far as he's concerned, kind of a mystery. Mm-hmm. And so one of the things that I was very concerned to think through in the piece I wrote for the McGillivray volume was, well, what is a proper naturalistic attitude that we might take here if we're willing to do something that I don't even think Chomsky wants to do, which to take very seriously the claims that some philosophers have made that there are certain mental phenomena which are only available to introspection. They're private. They're known only by direct acquaintance in consciousness. And there is kind of a problem about understanding how this irreducibly subjective aspect of the mind might fit into the natural order. How did the natural order throw it up? In what way can we make sense of it? Because the natural order is generally studied from a third person point of view. It's a completely public thing. And so I was concerned that on the one hand, Chomsky was not very sympathetic to this particular obsession of philosophers with the so-called problem of consciousness and its relation to the rest of the world. And that is what the mind body has turned into in contemporary terms. It isn't any longer Descartes' question about how the mind can interact with the body. It's this other question about the place of consciousness in the natural order. And anyway, so there are things one might pursue in this regard, such as what are the cognitive abilities that human beings have by virtue of which they can conceive something as available only to themselves and not to one another? Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. How can they also think about think of one another as creatures with such abilities to have this private inner show of consciousness. What kind of cognitive ability does this involve? And I think it involves the use of imagination, but it seems to me that there's more than one use we have of the same imaginative capacity to take something we know from the first person point of view and conceive other first person points of view as enjoying the same thing. Right? So consciousness is one example, but I think bodily perspective is another one. Like I can ask, what does the world look like from your position, right? And also rational exchange is another one where I can think, well, what would I believe if I had your beliefs, and what would I infer from your beliefs? And they might not be my beliefs, but I can project myself into your point of view. So I think there's something to study there about whether that's one ability, that social ability to think the points of view of others, or many abilities. I think there's something to think about in connection with limitations on social abilities like autism. And I think there's also a really interesting question about whether the subjective dimension of mind that the philosopher focuses on when they use the word consciousness makes any difference to mental life. Like I actually think, and that's why I call it the mind-to-mind problem. So we can imagine many of the computations Chomsky posits as going on, even if there's nothing it's like for them to go on. And in fact, he thinks many of them are blind and unconscious. And he thinks confining mental life to what we're directly aware of in consciousness is an unscientific and implausible sort of move in the study of mind. And he's quite right. And philosophers who want to follow Descartes in saying, no, we're going to shrink the mind to what we directly know in consciousness are just misguided. And I think he's right about that. But I think exploring in what way consciousness, what kind of role consciousness could play when it plays a role, whether it's uniform across individuals, for example, is an interesting question. I think, is it a problem or a mystery? I think it's a problem. I think it's something to be pursued. And it's not like the problem that Chomsky wants to say is a true mystery, which is the connection between the place of freedom in the natural order.
No, that's really fascinating, and maybe usually when this discussion on the mind-body problem is happening, it's kind of taking a metaphysical position in the sense of either a physicalist or a dualist, but in the end, as far as I understand, Chomsky doesn't seem to have a specific, metaphysical stance on this issue. More of a neutral stance. Is that right? And you do think that that is a legitimate sort of position, that given the information that we have, where we are in sort of scientific progress, we can stay neutral on this sort of metaphysical issue? Like, do you think that's a legitimate stance to have on this issue?
Absolutely. I think Chomsky's instincts are sort of pluralist. He advocates methodological pluralism in the special sciences. He thinks you're not bound to be worried about whether the fruits of cognitive science will cohere with your current physical theory or not. You'll have to wait and see. He thinks the unity of science is a great goal, but doesn't guarantee that we'll be able to achieve it. And I think all of that just shows open-mindedness, a kind of let's look and see. Let's look and see how many kinds of things there are and how many kinds of relations we can find. And having a sort of once and for all pronouncement about how many big categories of things there are in the world looks like a very unscientific and almost theological kind of aspiration.
Yeah, he prefers to talk about aspects of the world, right? Where he puts like the mental next to the chemical, the optical, etc. Therefore, opening, I guess, a wider range of inquiries. Last thing that I want to highlight here that seems to me still kind of prominent in philosophy. So when I was doing my master, Chomsky's conception about this sort of issue was never even raised. While Chomsky, besides just the mind-body problem, I guess, also raises this more as just a lesson for science more broadly, right? Where he says, okay, we went from describing an intelligible external world to just describing intelligible theories. So therefore also stressing the importance for science as a project, and then saying that Descartes was actually engaging in a scientific sort of question, while now people usually make fun, or at least what I know of Descartes, kind of talking about the ghost in the machine, while Chomsky turns around sort of that question. So why is there still such a reluctance, I guess, to kind of discuss Chomsky's view in sort of in sort of philosophy departments, I guess, related to this issue? At least what I know of course, you like seriously engaging with this issue, but yeah, that's at least what it seems like to me.
Yeah, I think many philosophers really are hung up on this so-called problem of consciousness. Mm-hmm. I think that's one reason. And I think that when Chomsky disposes of the traditional mind-body problem that Descartes raised, he didn't notice that it doesn't really directly address the problem of privacy and the sort of qualitative aspects of mental life. And that's because as a scientist, he doesn't see much to do with them. And I also think that his own philosophical background makes him rather inhospitable to this whole domain. I'm talking about Ryle and Wittgenstein and many of the philosophical behaviorists who, he talks, he would talk about the dark night of behaviorism, no doubt, inner life is inner life for sure. But I think that most of mental activity is completely public in some sense, in the sense that makes it an appropriate target for scientific study. And so when you start to define consciousness as something that resists that by its very nature, just because it's private, it just starts to look like it's going to fall by the wayside as a bunch of nonsense or a pseudo question or something else. And I think philosophers, on the other hand, many of them are in the grip of Descartes' idea and also Searle's idea when he responded to Turing, that there is something it's like, and that there would be no mindedness without it, not just because we're creatures who have sensations, but they think it's a condition of intentionality. Yeah. And they're so focused on intentionality, I think, that they don't really grapple with this very, very large and I think well-motivated set of commitments that Chomsky brings to the study of mind. I think philosophers would do very well to pay more attention.
Yeah, no, certainly.
I think one way to diagnose why philosophers don't give up on the problem of consciousness, that just vexes them and doesn't go away, is that unlike what happened with Newton, right, when contact mechanics was just shattered by action at a distance, by the positing of gravitation, right? Newton was very, very anxious that he had introduced something occult, and everybody was anxious, right? But he could change the subject by saying, well, I'm just going to give you the laws, right? Which account for, so Newton's laws accounted for a phenomenon, for phenomena, even though the deep underlying thing remained a mystery.
Yeah.
Right. Whereas there are no laws for consciousness.
I see. Okay.
Right. So it never goes away. I mean, you sort of, it remains as a philosophical issue. Whereas Newton was able to change the subject by saying, okay, look, forget about the deep unintelligible questions. Let's do what's intelligible. And he did it. He actually produced the laws. There are no laws to produce for the consciousness case. So people continue with the philosophy.
No, that's a very interesting observation. Although at one point, I mean, as Chomsky might say, usually when something is long enough a mystery, people just move on to other questions. So maybe that still has to happen. Maybe it won't. Who knows? Only the future will tell. But kind of moving on to another topic that has been sort of prominent in Chomsky's discussions and philosophical views is, the question: is referential semantics possible? And you identify two main reasons why Chomsky seems to be skeptical of the possibility of referential semantics. So maybe Professor Bilgrami, could you maybe explain Chomsky's reason for skepticism with regards to this question?
Yeah, when it comes to these so-called atomic elements, what he thinks are misleadingly called words and lexical items, uh, I think he thinks it's basically that the idea of their possessing reference is very contextual. He gives the example of the concept of a person, which is, if you just look at Locke and the whole history of the concept of a person, it's just, there's so many different views and, what people, and in general, I think a good way to bring out the point he's making about the contextuality of reference is if you look at what Frege said when he raised the Frege puzzle about reference, right? And what Frege showed was that people refer mediated through concepts and through beliefs. So people's conceptions of things are very important in what they refer to in their speech. And this is partly also what Strawson was stressing. And that's why somebody like Fodor, who's very keen to give up purely denotational semantics or referential semantics, struggled over 3 books with Frege's puzzle. Really, over 3 books he grappled with it. And basically, in the end, he gave up. And I think he just said, well, this is the best of all possible worlds. Frege puzzles arise very seldom, And I think it's the contextuality which is forced by people's conceptions of things when they refer that makes referential semantics well nigh impossible as a scientific account. It's too contextual for that. One consequence of this, is that Chomsky is known to have said that it's better to, if you think semantics is to be thought of in referentialist terms, in terms of truth conditions and reference, you should really see it as part of pragmatics rather than semantics. Yeah. And he cites Wittgenstein and cites Austin and so on. And one way I think to bring that out is to consider one thing in Wittgenstein which brings it out. Chomsky hasn't put it this way, but I think it captures what he has in mind. You see, Wittgenstein had a very, very interesting and very deep idea in describing intentional actions. When he said that there's something which is a basic action. And he gives that example of one's arm going up versus one doing various things with one's arm, let's say like waving to a friend or something like that, moving one's arm, waving to a friend, etc. And he thinks that, so let's take as an example, waving to a friend. Now, Wittgenstein says that's a basic action. What does he mean by that? It means that when I, in the standard case, wave to a friend, I'm doing something and I'm not doing anything else in virtue of which I do it, right? So the waving to a friend is basic. So when he said this, what he was doing was opposing people who thought what was basic was my arm going up, and then various intentions accrued to that. So you have the intention to move your arm, right? That makes your arm going up a moving of your arm. And then a further intention accrues to it, which is to wave to a friend. And that makes for the action waving to a friend. Right? So there's something very basic, which is the arm going up, and then with accrual of various intentions, you get a non-basic outcome, action, waving to a friend. And Wittgenstein says, no, this is all wrong. The basic thing is waving to a friend. Right? Now, if you apply this to language, right? So take something, so people who believe in referential or truth conditional semantics, right, unlike Chomsky, say, I intend to say something with certain truth conditions, and by doing that, I intend to convey something. So the pragmatic outcome is I convey something, but I do it by first doing something which has certain truth conditions, by saying something which has certain truth conditions, right? So take metaphors. I say man is a wolf, right? And Davidson, who believes in truth conditional semantics, says, I intend to say something with certain truth conditions, right? That man is a wolf. People hear me and they realize that he couldn't possibly really be intending that, because it intend to convey that man is a wolf because it's so obviously false, right? So they look for a more interesting meaning, right? But if Wittgenstein's idea of a basic action is right, there's a basic speech action, right? One just says man is a wolf. One doesn't say something with certain truth conditions in order to say something else. One just says man is a wolf. And that's the basic speech action. Right? Just like the waving to a friend is a wave. And if that's right, that's not susceptible to a scientific, there's no truth condition there. Right? The truth conditions, if that is the basic speech action, the truth condition stuff is irrelevant.
I see.
Right? So it just falls into pragmatics, right? You just conveying that human beings are aggressive or whatever the metaphor conveys. So the important thing here, I think, is that like Wittgenstein, Chomsky really believes that when you have e-languages and when you have intentionality to communicate, etc., right, it doesn't go via more basic things like truth conditions. You just convey things. The basic thing is to convey that human beings are aggressive through the metaphor. You don't do it by doing anything else.
I see.
Like saying something with certain truth conditions. But that only applies to e-languages, to things said intentionally, etc. None of that applies to I-languages, because remember, that's got nothing to do with intentionality, externalization, communication, etc. It's just so all the points he makes about what's scientifically tractable just are irrelevant when it comes to intentionality, etc. And there I think he would just take Wittgenstein's line on basic actions and basic speech actions, and so truth conditions are irrelevant.
And just to build,
in just the way that moving my arm is not relevant to waving to a friend. It's not the more basic thing in virtue of which I wave to a friend.
And when he's dividing it then between syntax and pragmatics, and some of it might actually enter into just the pragmatics, like the semantics in the traditional sense entering into pragmatics. Is there still also a part, it seems to me, right, from the sort of semantic project that does fit within syntax as well, that is usually maybe interpreted as semantics, but he kind of puts it in the category of syntax? And what does that sort of semantic project look like when it's much more maybe in the structural sense where meaning already seems to appear?
Exactly. So it's whatever it is, it wouldn't be reference and truth conditions and so on, right? It would just mean the computational working on symbols, the computations that one performs on symbols, etc. That would be, but it's not. The idea of representation is not. It has relations to each other, but it doesn't have relations to something in the world. It's not representation of something.
Yeah. No, certainly. And then maybe as a final question, and the last chapter in the book, what is the common good? So Chomsky connects here, the individualist stance to us as social beings. So how should we understand this relationship? Because again, a lot of his scientific work is focused on us as biological beings, in the form of I language, competence, etc. So there we still have, of course, our creative capacities, and that connects also to us as social beings. So how should we try to understand this, and also in the relationship with the common good more broadly?
Yeah, so I think the very broad idea is that if you look at human creativity as it emerges in language, and Chomsky thinks that's so basic to our capacities, um, as possessors of language, that human creativity and in all its enormously diverse, even unbounded domain, is something that we ought to, in our social and political arrangements, given that it's a natural possession of ours, we ought to let it flourish.
Mm.
Right? So anything that thwarts it is something that I think his idea of a social and common good would should reject, because it's so natural for human beings to exercise this creativity, this freedom that they have, and I think that chapter you're referring to in that book, What Kind of Creatures Are We, basically looks at how you can thwart this thing, this creativity and this freedom to create that we have as possessors of language, but which is a much wider capacity than just as it surfaces in language. It's thwarted by two different things. He thinks that capitalism in the modern period has thwarted it, and he thinks that the state thwarts it. And he thinks authoritarian states, and he talks particularly of the Soviet Union and states with large bureaucracies and so on, thwarted. So it gets thwarted from two different directions. The state's authoritarianism as well as capitalism. And he even cites Adam Smith, who's often taken to be a proponent of capital as requiring constraints on capital, because capital, given all those things about division of labor, the famous passages, thwart human creativity. So that's a very interesting thing. And then he goes on to show how philosophers like Dewey and others have shown how it is least thwarted when there's democratic participation. And he points out that actually existing democracies, in fact, and it's sort of one of the wonderful things about Chomsky is that most of his energy is spent criticizing actually existing democracies rather than the Soviet Union or even Nazi Germany and so on. He takes it for granted that those are terrible things, but he thinks that we live in actually existing democracies. He lives in actually existing democracies, and it's his duty to criticize that much more, because he's living here and he can make a difference to it. So one of his points is that in actually existing democracies, education and certain attitudes which require people to not participate, even as they are democracies, because the democracies are purely formal. So one of the people he criticizes very harshly is somebody like Walter Lippmann, who thinks that democracy is actually should not have the noise of democracy. You should just have an electoral clock. People should come and vote every 4 or 5 years, and then for the rest, let the bureaucracies, the state, and others do their thing. And Chomsky's against that, because he thinks people should be educated to know what's going on. And Lippmann actually thinks educating people too much about politics is a bad thing. You should leave it to the experts, and they should all that democracy consists in is the electoral clock every 4 or 5 years. And he thinks all of that is in actually existing democracies curbs people's creativity, because you then make education just a matter of producing the right expertise or just distracting people from the real issues, because the noise of democracy is despised by people like Lippmann and others. And in fact, I think his criticism of the media, which he's been so famous for, is precisely that it makes people less participatory by withholding the truth from them.
Mm. Yeah, no, certainly. So, Professor Rovane and Professor Bilgrami, this has been really great. I would, recommend anyone to read the book, What Kind of Creatures Are We? That is covering a lot of ground, and I think it's a fun read. So, yeah, thank you so much.